Thanks, Joe, and thank you for inviting me. Everyone, I was going to say my presentation on financial regulation is going to feel like a come down, I think, after swimming pools and nightclubs and colour experiments. So apologies in advance. So as I said, I'm Alex Chesterfield. I currently lead a behavioural risk team in internal audit at one of the UK's biggest banks. I think it's one of the first behavioural science teams in internal audit, and the goal of our team is really to try and protect our employees and customers and help understand, help I guess prevent any problems. So I love the job in the team. It's super interesting. I'm actually here today to talk about some of the research I did with former colleagues at the UK's financial regulator, the FCA, who really pioneered using experimental methods to inform financial regulation. And again, for those who are thinking, what the hell is regulation? Regulation ultimately tries to make financial services markets so work better every day for consumers. And if you think a lot of our life, every time we buy something, our current accounts, maybe if we own a house or the mortgage, when we buy things on a credit card. So it's one of those financial services, one of those markets that's in the background. It's very much a hygiene factor, but it does make a lot of things in our lives day to day possible. So the regulator exists to try and make the markets work as well as possible for consumers. So I'll be talking mainly about my experiences at the FCA, as most of the research that my former colleagues and some of myself did is published. So you can go, so listeners and watchers now can go and read up on those studies in much more detail. And I should also say, as an ex-regulator and someone currently working in internal audit, that this session is very much my personal reflections and don't reflect the views of any current or prior organisation that I work for. A bit more formally, I studied cognitive and decision science at UCL. So I think I saw a glimpse earlier on of Bedford Way, which I have very fond memories of. And I'm also actually co-authoring a book on why we divide and how we can bring people back together. It's called Poles Apart. This is a plug. It's published in September with Penguin Random House. But back to this session, I was going to touch on 4 things. So first of all, one is my role at the FCA. Second, why the FCA runs experiments, why it chose to do that. Third, what types of experiments were run when I was there. And the current team is still very much doing experiments and they're growing. It's a fantastic team. I can highly recommend working there if jobs do come up at the FCA. And then fourth, what we learned in the process. I'm not going to use slides. No slides. It's just going to be me. It's just going to be me talking. So I hope that's okay. So first of all, number one is my role at the FCA. So I was hired to help bring in a more realistic view of human behaviour into the behavioural economics team at the FCA. So a lot of regulators are staffed by super lovely and very smart people, often with economics or legal backgrounds to write regulation or supervise firms. So behavioural scientists, whether that's economics, psychology, neuroscience, sociology, are very much in the minority. And that means that they lack an important perspective, especially given the role is ultimately to try and understand why firms behave the way they do and then why consumers behave the way they do. And I previously worked at Which, so the consumer champion, and used lots of mixed methods, so qualitative and more quantitative, to understand where consumers were facing problems and challenges in different markets, and how government or regulators or business might be able to solve those problems. So I worked at the FCA for 3 years. It was an incredibly diverse team. There's experimental economists, behavioural economists, neuroscientists, biologists, and linguistic people with linguistics backgrounds. So it's a really diverse team, and I think that was a really important part of making it effective. And the goal of the team was to use methods and insights from behavioural economics or behavioural science more broadly to help inform the decisions of the organisation. So a bit more specifically, that means to inform the regulations, so the rules that were being made about how firms should behave, about how the FCA supervised firms, and then also latterly the team was applying behavioural science to some of its own internal operations. So, for example, how to promote diversity and inclusion in the organisation. So that's the first part of my role at the FCA. Second, I was going to touch on was why the FCA runs experiments, because it really did pioneer, and that's much credit to Stefan Hunt and Paul Adams, who really set the team up back in 2013. There was a few things, I guess, just to zoom out for a moment, there was a few things that happened which meant banks and the wider ecosystem, so regulators, government, etc., needed to start thinking about behavioural science and why the behavioural economics team was set up at the FCA. So first of all, let's start with the financial crisis of 2008. So that was a precursor for the UK government, their decision to split the financial regulator, previously the FSA, into two. So one part of the regulator, or one part of the regulation's role, which was looking after what's called the stability of financial markets, so making sure that all the money is moving in the right places, and that the markets as a whole weren't going to collapse. That moved to what is known as the Prudential Regulatory Authority under the Bank of England. And then the FCA, that's the part that I was in, the Behavioural Economics team, that would focus on the other part, the regulation, so what's called conduct regulation. So conduct is basically how firms behave. And that supervised more than 56,000 financial services firms and over 140,000 what are called approved individuals. So that's people like giving financial advice, for example. So anyway, so the creation of the FCA in 2013, which focuses very much on conduct, that's the C in FCA, led to new objectives from Parliament, including the need to promote competition. So competition across financial services markets. So people switching, again, and I guess the theory is that more people switch, that would drive up value and quality and lower prices for customers. So it's a good thing. We want more competition. So that was one of the new regulators' objectives in 2013, plus a renewed focus on consumers, so protecting consumers. And if you want to protect consumers and promote competition, then you've got to understand both how consumers behave and how that affects competition in markets. So on that basis, the FCA had a clear mandate to start thinking and using behavioural science. But as well as the financial crisis, I think in parallel, you had the launch of Nudge, for example. So I think that was published back in 2008. One of the book's authors, Cass Sunstein, who was appointed as Obama's regulation chief in 2009. The book's other author, Thaler, advised the UK's new Prime Minister, Cameron, which set up the Behavioural Insights team. So there's lots of noise around behavioural science happening at the same time, or shortly after the financial crisis happened. So I think that broader popularisation of behavioural science, obviously there's been decades and decades of behavioural science, but the popularisation of it, the fact that governments were starting to use behavioural science, combined with the financial crisis, led policymakers, academics, kind of the great and the good, kind of ask that question, why did the financial crisis happen, despite the plethora of rules and regulation and governance and compliance? Why did we get this financial crisis that hardly anyone actually predicted? So those two things combined, I think, led to much more focus on behaviour within financial organisations, also culture, organisational culture, and then how that influences business models, products, customer journeys, and interactions with customers. And the two people that set up the behavioural economics team knew it wasn't just enough to bring in the theory about what might work, despite best intentions and despite the best behavioural economics theory. You still don't really know whether a rule will work in practice, whether it will solve the problem that it's designed to do and to help customers. So that led to the realisation that experiments or randomised controlled trials, so field trials, can help the FCA to be a more effective regulator and ultimately help customers. So that's where it started. So third part of my session, I was going to touch on what types of experiments the FCA ran, and I guess to sum it up, many. One of the first ones, this was before I joined, one of the first ones that the team did, I think this shows the journey that the team went on, but one of the first ones, first randomised controlled trials, so field trials that the team ran, by the founders, Paul Adams and Stefan Hunt, was on optimising communications that firms were sending to consumers. And these communications that firms were sending were trying to put things right that had gone wrong. So, for example, if products had been missold, these letters were telling customers that actually they could have a potential claim, potential rights to get compensation, or redress as it's more formally known in financial services. But the challenge was that firms were sending these letters telling customers that they were potentially owed money, compensation, but the response rate was very, very low. So the team, the head economics team, saw an opportunity to do a randomized controlled trial. So the focus of the research is very much on how to encourage consumers who may be due redress, who may be due the opportunity to get money back, to respond to these letters. So how do we increase the response rate to these letters? So the team worked on a real case with a firm that was voluntarily writing to almost 200,000 customers about the failing that it had in its sales process. So 7 treatments were designed. So these were really basic. This was done back in probably 2014. This was kind of in the early stages, I guess, of nudge and behavioural science. But there were 7 treatments designed. So one, for example, was adding a message to an envelope to try and encourage people to open the letter in the first place, simplifying the text, sending a reminder, etc. Add bullets was another one. So again, that was a way of simplifying the text. I think they changed the name of the respondent, so the chief exec versus the sales manager. So almost changing the messenger again to see what would work empirically. Now, in terms of what the results were, the control letter, so that was the one that the firm was sending out historically that had the very low response rate. The control rate in the trial received a 1.5% response rate. So only 1.5% of all customers that the letter was being sent to, so almost 200,000 were responding, so really low. When I guess looking across the treatments and what worked and what didn't, the team found that salient bullets, salient bullet points, which was making that text stand out more, so more prominent to the reader, was really effective. So that alone increased the response rate. So from 1.5% in the control group to nearly 4%. So again, that's still low at an absolute level, but relatively a jump from 1.5% to 4% is quite effective just for adding some bullet points. But when the bullet points were combined with other treatments, that boosted the response rate to 12%. So again, arguably at an overall absolute level, 12% is still quite low, but at a relative level, from 1.5% to 12%, that's really effective. I mean, that's equivalent to about an additional 20,000 people responding to get money that they're owed. So here, the learning from that first randomized controlled trial with a firm was that small changes do work, and then internally in the organisation, the importance of getting that early use case, or quick win, we can call it, to get buy-in to doing more field trials and getting more resource, getting more people into the team to do more of these trials. And if anyone's interested in reading on about that in more detail, if you just Google occasional FCA, occasional paper number 2, you can read all about the trial and the results and the stats in more detail. Actually, just before I left, a couple of years ago, I ran a similar trial with colleagues with pawnbroking customers at one of the UK's biggest pawnbroking firms. So pawnbroking it's actually a very old method of lending money. So if you read lots of Dickens, it features in there. So it's a way of people give a watch and they get a loan essentially for that good. And then if you can't repay the loan, then the pawnbroking shop keeps your watch or your item of jewelry as kind of collateral. So anyway, but there's a similar problem. So here with the pawnbroking firm, money was on the table. So pawnbroking customers were owed money, and these customers are quite vulnerable as well. So the actual absolute amounts that they were owed were quite low, but again, for the customers, that it was quite a lot of money, but they weren't claiming the money. So from a behavioural perspective, that again was really challenging, but also interesting that there's money on the table that people are owed, but why aren't they getting it? And again, if people are interested to look at this, if you just Google FCA occasional paper number 59, you can read all about this trial in more detail. But here, I want to tell you about this one. It's interesting because here we integrated design principles into the start. So way before we even got to the randomized controlled trial with the firm, we worked with actually a design academic at Cardiff Met to understand more qualitatively why these customers weren't responding to the communications that the firm was sending out. These we wanted to understand these people's lives. Like none of us had used pawnbroking firms before. We could come up with some barriers, but they were likely to be wrong. So we wanted to speak and understand people's lives in context, in broader context, before designing an intervention to try and get them to respond and get the money that they were owed. So we worked with designers doing some really deep ethnography, observation work of these people, and then we also co-designed with them what might work to then test in the field trial. And another learning was, I think this is around having humility. So again, I was working in the FCA with some really good like behavioral data scientists who are amazing. We had some of the supervisors on board again who worked with the firm. We had people at the firm involved. And whilst behavioral scientists are good at many things, we're not always good at designing communications to that people will open, click, read, understand, take the required action. So I think having that humility and realizing that often you need other disciplines involved in the mix, other methods to try and solve your problem was a really important learning from that first trial done years ago to where we got to. And the result of that pawnbroking trial was that the behaviourally informed letter, which was, you can tell we had designers involved. It doubled collection rates. So again, that was really powerful for customers that we were helping. There was actually a second intervention that we trialed that was much more focused on the interface that staff in the pawnbroking stores were using with customers. We did a lot of data analytics in the background. That's actually still in field. So when that is finished, that will come out in good time. But as we learn more, so as the team progressed, as the team grew, from using field trials, other experimental methods we use included online experiments, quasi-experimental methods. So where doing a field trial, or online experiments wasn't possible. It was like, well, what econometric methods can we use to infer causality from the data that we get from firms, and also integrating other tools and insights prior to getting to a field trial or to an online experiment to really inform the design of the intervention. Now, I was going to finish, Joe, I can see you on. I was going to finish on my 5 learnings, and I have got another example of it, but I'll just do the 5 learnings and leave it there. Okay, right. So what did we learn in the process? 5 learnings from doing experiments at the FCA. One was integrate experimental methods with other methods, particularly qualitative at the start, to understand why people are behaving in that particular context before you then test interventions. First. Second is online experiments are so much cheaper and so much faster and a real alternative to field trials if the decision context is replicable. So, for example, in an online investment context, that makes an ideal situation rather than doing a field trial to actually simulating that decision online. Also, it doesn't necessarily have to take the place of field trials. We also use online experiments. This is published as well, prior to a field trial to whittle down all the possible interventions that we could do, again, to save time and money once we're actually in field working with banks. Learning 3 was to manage the expectations of senior leaders. This is like the biggest learning, I think. There's so much uncertainty ahead of going into an experiment. You have got no idea what works. As I said, even I worked with this is not me, some of my colleagues were so brilliant, so qualified, and even with the best colleagues working with the best academics, a lot of the time stuff still doesn't work or it backfires. And actually, that is not a failure. That is not a failure. You still learn something. So an experiment never fails. You always learn something unless the experiment is badly designed. But that's hard. So that, I think, managing expectations upfront with stakeholders is really, really important. And framing it as we are de-risking this process. Like that, I found that helped. Number 4 is the value of an interdisciplinary team. So again, you need that combination of very, very quantitative people, who know the experimental methods, who can analyze data, who can push forwards, but you also need people that can manage internal relationships, stakeholders, and the creative skills to design the good treatments and communicate those to stakeholders. And then number 5, despite best intentions, treatments don't always work. So that initial effect that you get, which can be have such a great impact, don't always work in the longer term. So look at longer term outcomes as well as that short term effect on decisions. That would be my 5th learning.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. I for one am very grateful that there are regulators in the UK who are sitting there sort of acting on behalf of consumers, making sure that companies have to make the reparations that they've been required to make. So thank you for that work there. One question that I wanted to ask you is, which of the projects that you've worked on have you been the most proud of? Because, you know, I can see you're doing real good in the world, but do you ever have that moment where you're like, oh, yes?
Yeah, probably the pawnbroking one that I mentioned. I think personally and selfishly, I learned a lot on that doing a real life world trial. So I was doing bits of coding, bits of data analysis, and working with some great colleagues who are, you know, really technically qualified. But mainly, I think secondly, mainly because the customers that we were helping, we had a tangible effect on really vulnerable customers who actually that money made a real difference to their day-to-day lives.